Here's a bit of an overview of the suspension setup on the front. This is pretty much exactly the same for the 981 series of cars, with a few exceptions at the upper end of that range, like the GT4 and that sort of thing. It's the same for the 718, the 991 and the 992. They're all 991 parts. So it's pretty much all going to look like this at the front. It's a simple McPherson strut that gets jammed down into the steering knuckle, some control arms at the bottom that are in a V that hold everything in place, and your steering connected to the front here to control obviously your steering. You've got your sway bar at the back here, which runs obviously to the other side. You've got two sway bar links. The one at the top is the pinch bolt for the McPherson strut. And depending on what you want to do, you are going to either remove some, all, or next to none of these parts to replace or check stuff underneath here. And I'll just go through that with you. At the front, which is where most of the stuff is happening, you've got the output from your steering gear. There's a ball joint at the end of that. You've got this arm which is connected here, which is the one that runs all the way up to the ball joint at the bottom of the steering knuckle. They will call this by a couple of different names, either the lower trailing arm or the wishbone, depending on where on the documentation you look. There is a bush in here, and like I said, there's a ball joint at the end there. In the middle of it is a bush in here, which is what this arm connects to. So that goes into a U shape. There's a big bolt that goes through the bush there, and there's a ball joint up the front, and that is jammed in between this big support plate which goes on the underside of the car and the frame of the car there. They call this here, there are three names that I've seen for this: either the diagonal arm, the longitudinal arm, or the control arm. So again, depending on where you look, it's a bit hard to work out what they're talking about. And especially when you're trying to work out what torque spec applies to what. You can see also in here we've got the sway bar which goes through the bracket for the sway bar bush in here. Removal of the sway bar itself requires a lot of effort because this whole support plate in here needs to be lowered down. There's a whole bunch of torque to yield bolts that hold that on, so that is a lot of effort to replace the sway bar itself. But the bushes is dead simple. I'll show you how to do that, and none of that stuff has to come out. To replace this arm here is very simple. You just disconnect the bolt in here, that slides out, and then you can either check that to see if there's looseness in the ball joint, or you can remove that bolt there. Now you can test that that's good just by pulling this out of the way and giving that a wiggle to check that if there's any looseness in there, to work out if you actually do need to disconnect that bolt. For the steering arm here, pretty simple, just to remove the nut off the top here, get a ball joint separator in here and pop that open. That comes apart very, very easily, and because this is way up in the open, it's very, very simple to get a ball joint separator onto that. And once you remove that, then I would suggest moving the steering knuckle all the way around like that, and then we're going to get access to this one in here. This was a little bit difficult because of just the way all the angles are here. Getting your ball joint separator in here and being able to get access to the bolt at the top was a bit hard. If you wanted to disconnect this, again, you don't need to disconnect this ball joint. You don't even need to disconnect the steering connection point. That can just come out. That nut, the bolt comes out, and then that just swings around like that. And now I can quite happily, now I've loosened that, you can feel some looseness in there because it's not tightened down, but if that was all torqued up, you'd very easily be able to move that around and check if there was some looseness in that and whether or not that needed to be replaced or not. With the arm in here, to check the bush in here, once we move this out of the way, it's very simple just to get access to the top of this and check if that bush needs replacing or not. To check this ball joint, we'll need to separate the ball joint in here, and then if we wanted to obviously remove this here to check the bush in there, and disconnect the bolt at the back here, and then that just comes straight out pretty easily. Torques for all of these, there's a whole bunch of different torque specs. For the ball joint here, 85 Newton meters. The ball joint there, 85 Newton meters. This one here is a torque to yield bolt because it holds the ball joint and squeezes it in between the support plate and the frame here. It takes 90 Newton meters plus 180 degrees of turn, and you'll need to replace that bolt. So for the bolt that goes through here, that's a big M14 bolt on that bush that takes 160 Newton meters. That is not torque to yield. The one in here takes 120 Newton meters. Again, it's not torque to yield. Depending on what you plan to do up the front here, will determine how much of this you need to pull apart. If you need to start removing some of the stuff down the bottom here, I would suggest removing the rotor, the caliper, hang it up over here to get it like this so this hard brake line is out of the way, because normally it runs on in between the steering knuckle and the sway bar link. I would disconnect the sway bar link. There's a nut on the other side. You pull that out of the way. That'll allow you to get the caliper all the way out there and hang it up somewhere. I've got the trim off the inside of the wheel housing here, and so I've got access to some places to hook it up on. You don't need to do that. You can just remove where these screws go in and just put a loop of wire and just screw it back in there just to hang it up there, and that just keeps it out of the way, so it gives you free rein to sort of do whatever you want in here. There's also this piece there, however that goes, that sits on the inside of the rotor. I would also advise getting rid of that, especially if you want to start to get in at the ball joints, etc. 3 screws on the outside, and that just pulls off very, very easily, and then it makes it pretty simple to get access to everything else behind it. Something that I didn't show earlier because I'd already pulled it off, the air guide, that will go through the steering arm that goes to the ball joint out on the steering knuckle. This is going to be connected to that forward arm, so it's one of the first things you want to remove when you remove the steering ball joint. The way this works is, you see those hooks, there's basically 2 of those, and you'll need to, with the arm there, sort of squeeze it around like that to sort of release that hook, and then just get a screwdriver up in here and lever this one out like that so they can come free. And then you'll have to maneuver it out of all of these clips. It's held in very, very firmly because obviously this is getting shaken like crazy as it's going up and down. Make sure you note where these all go and put them back in the right spot. At the front for the ride height sensor, to disconnect this, we're going to leave all of this in place. We're going to disconnect it down here and leave this plastic piece which is attached to the wishbone in place. On the other side of this connection here, there is a nut you're going to counter hold at this position here, so just disconnect that and this thing will just pull straight off. So removing the steering arm link, very simple. Obviously we're just going to pop that ball joint out of there, and that can get taken out. And if we need to replace this section here, then we're just going to undo the nut there, screw that off and put a new one on. You can feel the ball joint and how nice and tight that is. If that's loose, that's clearly bad. And also you can move this around because there's another big ball joint up in here that if it is damaged and loose, then this whole arm from there to there would need to be replaced. So here's the ball joint removal tool that I have. It's got a kit with a number of these with different widths in the bit that fits underneath here. And if you've never used one of these before, all you're doing is you are shoving that in there, and then you adjust the height of this thing here, so when we then turn this, it's going to squeeze in there and pop the ball joint out of here. So that's obviously come off, but if it would be doing something like that, and then the ball joint's free, and then you can remove the nut from the top. I would suggest when you're doing these that you leave the nut on so it's flush with the top of the screwed thread, so it's a greater surface area and it's not going to mar the top of the screwed thread, because for example this one has a Torx fitting into it, so if you need to hold it whilst you're turning this on and off because it's a lock nut, then that helps you out, so you don't want to damage the top of that. There are different types of tools available. This is one that I bought years ago. It's pretty typical of stuff that you buy from an automotive store. The problem is that this gap here isn't adjustable. There's not as much leverage, and also these jaws that fit in here are often not the right size because they're going to come in all different shapes and sizes, and having the correct one here, because for example the bottom of the boot, I don't want to damage that. I want it wide enough to go on the outside here on the metal only, so these components don't get damaged. One of the hardest parts I found of this job, because most of it's pretty simple, the hardest bit was to get access to this ball joint in here, and I jimmied up some tools to make it work until I worked out exactly what the Porsche engineers had in mind when they designed this to get this out really easily, because most things on this car are pretty simple. First thing you want to do is loosen the 3 screws at the top on the mount underneath the hood so we can move the strut around. I'm then going to remove this big bolt from here, and I'm just going to rotate the steering so it's pointing in the direction as far as it can go that you are working on. So this is working on the right hand side. Turn it as far as you can to the right. If you want to disconnect the ball joint here, you can, but you don't need to do that. With that bolt disconnected, I can just pull that out of the way like that. And now what I'm going to do is remove the bolt from up in here. And because I've removed that now, and this is out here, I can just grab hold of this and just pull this out. Just give it a wiggle, and that'll just come free, like that. And now what I can do is I can swivel that around to wherever I want, either way you like, and get easy access underneath here to that ball joint for removal. And so what we've got a ball joint on the outside. You can check how good condition that is. It should be nice and tight and snug, certainly no looseness in it. You can have a look at the bush on both sides, check that there's no splits. And for this one here, you can't really see the bush because it's got these metal caps on the outside. If you get a screwdriver in here between the rubber and the metal piece on the outside, it's just pressed into. You can see the ring in the middle. That's part of the bush. You can just pop that off, and then you can get access to the side of the bush and check that there's no damage or anything. And then to get that back on, I just put those on in the right position, then put it between a vise and just squeeze together, and they just went on very easily. This just pulls straight out. Now, it's normally in fairly tightly, but there's another nut a little bit further along here, which is sort of a thread that has a dowel on it that sort of positions this big support plate underneath. If you just loosen that off, it just opens this up ever so much, so this thing can slide out and in again very, very easily. That only takes 30 Newton meters. It's not torque to yield, so you can easily loosen that one just inboard of this screw here to get that out to replace that if required. Removal of the sway bar bush is pretty simple. There are 2 screws that come in from the underside. They are a 16mm socket. You'll need to counter hold at the top, and you just remove those. The cap will just come straight off, and then the bush can just be moved out there, and then it can just get pulled off quite happily. These are dry inside. I've heard of people getting squeaks and that sort of stuff with them. To lubricate these, personally, I would use graphite to keep it dry, but whatever floats your boat. But as you can see, they are very simple to get access to and replace the bushes if you needed to. For install, it just sits nicely into some sort of slots in the bottom there. Cap just goes straight on. Put the 2 screws, counter hold at the top on the nut, and then tighten to 65 Newton meters is what you want. Prior to removing the strut, I would just put a paint pen on one side of the mount, which is the silver thing here, and where that is relative to the frame of the car. And the reason for that, the 3 studs here, when you are putting this back in, it's not immediately obvious what orientation they need to be in, and it's much simpler. It only goes one way, and it's much simpler if you've got that marked, so you can just have everything in the right spot and just plonk it straight up there while you're trying to manhandle this thing from underneath. But to remove this, we're just going to remove the 3 nuts from the top. You can just leave one in there so it's hanging like that, and with it just hanging by one there, you can support that from underneath with your hand. It's not that heavy. And once that last one is out, then the strut just comes straight out. Here is the strut when it's out. We can see the steering knuckle down here. This is the sway bar link. That's the pinch bolt which holds the strut in place here. So once we get it like this, the first thing I'm going to do is just disconnect that. You'll need to counter hold it here at the hex in there. Then that just comes out. This just slides straight off, and then we can start to disassemble the strut itself. So to disassemble the strut, I'm going to put my spring compressor tool on here. I'm going to compress all of that. And then I'm going to remove the nut on the top here off the central point of this. I can counter hold that with a T45 Torx. The nut on the inside, I'm not sure exactly what size it is, but that's an old 13/16 spark plug spanner. And the nice thing about that is I can fit that through there to counter hold. That goes on, and I can put a spanner on that whilst holding that. And that's what I want, because I want to be able to torque that up as well afterwards. Now, as you can see, this is a standard strut. It's not a PASM strut. The PASM strut has an electrical connector going directly into here, which has a hex piece on the outside of it. I don't know, and there's no instructions in the workshop manual of how to disconnect that. So, yeah, I'm not going to be able to give you much help there. But certainly for this, it's a very simple process of compressing the spring, loosening that off, and everything just comes apart easily. And as you're compressing the spring, what you'll want to do is compress the central piston of the strut. What you're going to do is just compress it until it becomes nice and loose at the top, because then you'll know that everything's relative, like the spring pressure is off. And then I'll actually be able to pull this up after I disconnect this. So the nut has come off there, the whole thing can come off, and now I'm going to release the spring pressure. And once it's like that, I can just grab the spring and pull it up, and it'll pull off the boot and everything with it, because it's not going to come out the bottom, and then that can just get pushed out the top. There's your spring. It's color coded depending on the suspension setup that you've got. You've got the boot here, the bump stop is jammed up inside there. I'm not going to leave that out, but if that was trashed, then it'd be pretty obvious looking at the inside of it. If that was all destroyed, then you could replace those. You've got a washer over the top here, and you've got this rubber boot. The spring needs to slot into there when you are fitting everything back together again. Other parts of this, we've got the top rubber mount, which is going to go like that. So again, like you did at the bottom, that needs to be rotated around when you plonk this thing on the top to the correct position prior to compressing everything, or prior to releasing the spring pressure. In addition to that, you've got this funny plate here, which is the thing that holds onto that thing. And this here is your bearing for your steering. To open that up, you just need to get a small screwdriver. Opening this up, cleaning it all out, and re-greasing. So that's just full of grease there, and the seals around the inside and the outside. And that there is your bearing, which is the thing that allows the strut to turn when you steer. There is, obviously that's part of the bearing assembly in there. That's sort of the underside of it. there's your bearing there. So there are two parts of that. You've got the bearing there, top and the bottom cup and cone. And in addition to that, there's this big black thing in here which can pop off there. And so they're all the bits to the strut. If I had this apart, like I said, I'd be cleaning all this out, putting new grease in there, etc. So everything's nice and new prior to putting everything back together. To put it all back together, obviously that all needs to just slot in there in the correct spot. That can push over the top of that and just push down into place. Make sure that moves nice and smoothly. None of the seal or anything is sort of bent up the wrong way or anything like that. These slots slot into the bits on the bearing side there. That can go pretty much anywhere you like. And then we can put all this back together again. Push that on there, make sure it's slotted around there correctly, and then I push it down a fair way. We can bring that up later on. Let's just make it a little bit easier to put the spring compressor and stuff on it in a moment. And once that spring pressure is all released, check that everything is in the correct position in here, as well as the bottom there. We can just get our boot and we can push that all the way up to the top. Make sure down the bottom here that that's nicely around the damper, and you're good to go to put that back in again. The steering knuckle here needs to be fitted to the strut prior to putting it back in the car. You can see the little thing here, that's what goes up into the slot there, so that just slides straight on. Make sure it goes all the way home. Then we can tighten this one up here. You don't have to torque it, we can do that later on in the car. It's going to be easier to put 85 Newton meters on this once everything is in the car, but at least tighten that down so the strut isn't going to come out, and then we can go and put that back in the car. So I've got the strut fully assembled. Make sure the top of this, the orientation is correct, so it's going to slot correctly up into the correct position. And then I can just put it in place and just put those nuts on the top of it, just in gently. Now I can put this ball joint in place. To work out the correct height to jack this up to prior to torquing the bush in here, you need to work out how high this needs to be. And the best way I've found to do that is the official datum measuring point for your ride height is at the front. There's a little platform with metal here. There's a rubber sort of grommet in the middle of it, but on the flat portion, measure between there and the ground. And what I would suggest you do is, before you do anything to the car and it's still sitting on the ground, you can look through the spokes of the wheel and quite happily see the underside of this bush and see where it sits. I would measure between there and the ground and the difference between there and the ground. And now, when I put all this back together again and I'm going to jack this up to tighten that bush in there, I'm going to jack it up to a point so I've got the same difference. And on my car that's in the shed, there's 48 millimeters difference between that and that. So this one here is 48 millimeters higher. But you just got to work it out what it is on your car, jack it to the correct position with the strut in place, and then torque everything down. To get this arm to the correct position prior to torquing the bolt at the back here, so we don't get stress on this bush when it's just sitting normally on the ground, I need to lift this up. I've just lifted it up using a normal trolley jack. I've lifted it up so the weight is just off the jacking point here, which means all the weight is on this, so this should be pretty close to the correct position. In addition to helping me torque this by pushing this ball butt joint up in here, I don't have to counterhole. This is just going to be jammed up inside here now, so I can easily go and torque this nut at the top here. As well as if there is going to be any difference with where this bush is going to be when it's in the correct position, to torque this nut up here in the correct position is going to be better as well.